to talk first about why this matters, because I think it's easy to sort of lose sense of the big picture. So my sense is that if we look back on this period, we'll sort of see it as kind of like we now look at the early days of the web or the early days of social media as this brief moment of remarkable diversity before social VR platforms kind of standardized and solidified, both in terms of the offerings as well as in terms of user expectations. So what do I mean by diversity in this sense? A brief aside, one of the things that I find really fascinating is that the different applications that I'll be talking about today all seem to have different answers to this question of what does it mean to be social in VR, in the sense that they reflect kind of competing models of social experience. So for some, social VR is an opportunity to become what someone else, sort of cosplay, right? For others, it's a world-building tool. For others, it's a substitute for a conference call. So we're in this kind of Cambrian explosion. I heard another speaker mention this idea. And we have this opportunity now to kind of shape the future of social VR before these standards become solidified, so we can be thoughtful about the kinds of experiences we want to nurture and the fundamental design choices that we need to make to get there. And second, in the future, social VR platforms are likely to have the kind of broad impact on society that contemporary 2D social media now carry, right? And this suggests, if we think about the kind of challenges of 2D media, 2D social media, this suggests a kind of strong imperative for research communities to better understand the role that design choices play in this medium. And third, as we think about the sort of broad changes on the horizon associated with climate change, so i.e. if we accept that humanity has like, what, 12 years to figure this out, right? And that social VR may very well play an incredibly important role, right? What does humanity have to do? Well, we have to build a broad-based international solidarity coalition around climate change, and we need to do it in a world that may involve things like post-travel, right? So social VR is going to play an increasingly vital role in that future. So we as a society have to get this right. Okay, so now on to the study. So just to kind of give you some structure here, this study is part of a two-phase project. Really what I'm going to be talking about today is the first phase. We're starting phase 2 now. But this first phase involves studying social VR designers, developers, and community managers and other experts, and sort of getting a bird's eye view on their perspective of this space. So our team started with 3 core questions. First, how do design choices shape pro-social interactions? What I mean by pro-social interactions is like positive forms of social interaction in VR. What are the key factors that either encourage that or undermine that? And how do creators of social VR, so the developers, as I mentioned, designers, other experts, how do they approach and prioritize these sorts of design choices? And what can we learn by taking this kind of, as I mentioned, a bird's eye view, of seeing across the specifics of any one application and instead kind of take in the entire landscape? And then finally, what are the ethical questions and implications and stakes of these choices? So the objectives here, again, to learn from expert perspectives, also to build a kind of preliminary design framework, so a way of talking about what these choices are and whether we should make one versus the other, and then finally a kind of meta perspective on this emerging ecology. So we interviewed 11 social VR industry experts spanning 7 applications, and for Facebook Spaces, it was really hard to get through their legal, but we culled information from existing write-ups and publicly available design reports. So in the interest of time, I'll be skipping over a lot of the kind of methods and the sort of specifics of our analysis, but I'd be happy to follow up after the talk if anyone's interested in the details. So the demographic breakdown of our interviewees was largely even by gender. Most of our informants live in North America, with 2 from Europe, and our interviewees actually represented a really remarkable diversity of positions, so from UX designer to programmer to co-founder to community support coordinator. And in terms of field sites, I'm guessing many in the room are fairly familiar, if not work currently on many of these applications. I'll be glossing over them with really broad strokes. So the sites that we looked at included Rec Room, which is a kind of activity-focused application that is aesthetically modeled. I didn't know this until I talked to one of our interviewees. It's modeled on a kind of rec center from the late 80s. And it's focused on activities that kind of branch off from a main lobby area. Altspace VR, it supports a range of devices. It's initially built as this kind of social VR platform for others to kind of design experiences in. And they emphasize now a kind of strong community engagement through live events. High Fidelity is a platform whose founders include Linden Labs, Philip Rosedale of Second Life, underscores world construction tools and sort of large-scale public events and performances. Facebook Spaces focuses on supporting interactions between people who already know each other in Facebook. And these interactions you'll see are kind of localized around a shared table. And importantly here, they're sort of emphasizing users' real identity, as Facebook tends to do. So users choose avatars based on kind of suggested Facebook photos. VR Chat is currently one of the most popular social VR platforms, and it's known for what some of the users have described to me as a kind of Wild West ethos. And at times it's struggled with harassment, but it's also a unique home for creative expression, identity play, embodied memes, etc. Another application that you may be less familiar with is Anyland. This is different from other social VR applications in that it does not allow importing of 3D models. Instead, all environments, objects, avatars, and interactions, everything you see in Anyland is authored by scratch from a small community of committed users. Mozilla Hub, finally, is a lightweight social VR meeting space for web VR. And Hub supports a wide range of hardware options. And one of the interesting things about Hubs is that users can bring in media from the web, including images and 3D models, and kind of improvise and play with this media on the fly. So finally, there's a few adjacent sites, I guess I would call them. We did interview people that are working on these sites, but they've kind of started to roll in how we're thinking about this space. That's Museum of Other Realities, which is due to be released soon, Big Screen, and Cisco Spark VR. So in the next section, I'm going to unpack the sort of like clusters of these convergent themes that we identified, as well as speak a bit to areas of anomaly or divergence. So some of the dominant themes that emerged out of these interviews was the importance of the role of place and space, strategies for shaping social norms, embodiment and social mechanics, onboarding as a kind of social buffering. And then we also surfaced these secondary themes around device interoperability and asymmetric forms of participation, as well as modes of bridging VR with the outside world. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of my emerging thinking on this topic, in particular around how do designers kind of guide users as they pivot from familiar social context to unfamiliar affordances and opportunities. And I want to think about whether this community feels confident that users can perform or discover this kind of pivoting move from the known to the unknown as well, and if so, how? So the first big category I'd like to talk about is this issue of shaping social norms. So all of the folks that we talked to said that this was a really important aspect, but they had really different tactics or approaches to answering this question of how do you shape social norms. So these things include, this sort of larger category includes things like moderation and community outreach, social catalysts or focused activities. So even among the sort of similarly open world environments where community engagement was particularly important, and we saw a great deal of diversity in terms of response to the question of how do you shape social norms when it comes to prioritizing moderation versus kind of proactive community outreach. And so this divide tended to flow from whether the application had access to a lot of human moderators or whether it was a kind of laissez-faire, hands-off approach. So the laissez-faire, hands-off approach applications tended to be Anyland and VR Chat, and the more sort of like community engaged, the folks that really focused on being able to have a human moderator involved or a sort of a community engaged leader. Those tended to be Altspace VR, Rec Room, and High Fidelity. Ishta Kapoor of Altspace in particular talks about the importance of seeding culture proactively instead of trying to correct problems reactively through moderation as a primary tool. And similarly, Rec Room Community Support Coordinator Adam Dormier in particular noted that the initial community of Rec Room created the seeds of a positive community in a way that later enabled them to lean on that community, that sort of seed community, to help encourage people to abide by the existing social norms that they wanted to see. So for high fidelity, the seeds of positive community were similarly shaped, but there the emphasis is really placed on a greeter. So when you go to high fidelity, if you haven't been before, there's usually a greeter in your first experience. They'll kind of answer any questions or guide you to new locations. And similarly, in AltSpace VR, Kapoor again noted that for first-time users, there's always a moderator to kind of show you the ropes, get the conversation going, make sure you feel grounded and at home. And so another sort of interesting component here is that both AltSpace VR and Rec Room not only have these kind of greeter roles, but they also empower certain key users as kind of ambassadors, and they grant them certain privileges to drive positive engagement with the community. So Dormier also noted the importance of kind of stuff laying around, what you might call social catalysts, that serve as social lubricants in Rec Room. So these are things like ping pong, dodgeball, basketball. Similarly, AltSpace creates kind of social catalysts that they describe as kind of icebreakers. An important sort of, a really key feature for the AltSpace VR interviewees that we talked to is this fireplace that you see on the left here, where you can do things like grill marshmallows or burgers, and have firecrackers, and just kind of play in an environment and explore with others as a kind of social lubricant. So a step beyond social catalysts, you can think about these activities to kind of focus attention and around these shared forms of social engagement. Community coordinator Tamara Hughes of Rec Room noted that activities are all kinds of, are all sorts of social lubricants in the sense that they're there to help people get over the awkwardness of talking to strangers. And so one strong divide, though, that we saw is in the ways that social VR designers are kind of approaching this issue of activity design. So here we see a divide between whether the designers see themselves as kind of activity crafters, or they see themselves as kind of providing a platform for others to design activities. So if you're familiar with AltSpace VR, it tends to position itself more as, or at least historically, it's positioned itself more as a platform that hosts content or experiences that other people create. Evan Sforza, mixed reality designer of AltSpace VR, noted it was never really our focus as a team to go out and build an activity. We were really hoping that the SDK developers would be the ones to go out and build activities. And I guess more recently, this seems to be changing. Ishta Kapoor noted that AltSpace is now taking a somewhat more hands-on approach to activity crafting. So another big topic here is this area of kind of embodiment and social mechanics. So a number of our interviews brought up this sort of super category. So overall, we observed general convergence among the social VR applications with respect to a kind of design choices related to embodiment, or design goals, let's say, related to embodiment and social mechanics. So these include things like avatar affordances, locomotion features like teleportation, personal space bubbles, sort of usual suspects, things like social mechanics of friending and blocking. What was interesting, though, is the specifics of implementation really varied. So nearly all of the applications we examined utilized tools for preventing harassment that a user could activate in the moment. So these include blocking, reporting, muting, or a panic button, as in the case of AnyLand, as well as personal bubbles, which are often turned off by default, depending on the application. Most of the applications, blocking occurs when a user points at the offending party and kind of pulls up a moderation menu to select block, for example. Some applications have collapsed blocking and reporting. The one I'm showing you right now is from Rec Room, and I think they've solved this in a really clever way. So for those of you who've actually tried this in Rec Room, they're sort of utilizing what you might call like an embodied skeuomorphism, in the sense of they're using this known gesture of like talk to the hand. And then when you do the talk to the hand gesture to someone who's harassing you, you see this option that sort of starts to circle around your hand, and if you've held it there long enough, they will disappear. And then you'll get options for reporting them in other ways, right? So when you're flustered and you like don't know how to go through your menus, this is a really quick and easy way to kind of engage with a moderation mechanism. Another broad category of user-directed moderation is the personal space bubble. So when it's activated, another user gets close, their avatar will begin to disappear as they overlap. So nearly all of the applications we examined employed some form of personal space management. But again, Rec Room had some interesting sort of embodied, subtle embodied features that they used in this particular context. So when a user attempts, if you see on the left there, when a user attempts to teleport into another's personal space bubble, they'll instead see a kind of dashed teleport preview line turned red. A number of applications have developed communication features that support pro-social interaction in other kinds of novel ways, in particular through community affordances and social mechanics. In Rec Room, there's voice indicators about avatars to help you know who's speaking at any given time. And they also cycle through kind of various emotional expressions, which apparently are weighted a little bit more towards happiness. So the default state is you're seeing people smiling at you, which is an interesting sort of finding there. Similarly, on the left, we see an example from AltSpace VR where there's this sort of life-size emojis that kind of emanate from your body. Ishta Kapoor, product lead at AltSpace, had some really interesting comments about using emojis as kind of as substitutes for gestures like the hand raise or clapping, especially when audiences are engaging with speakers, such as in town hall events. Yeah, so here's another, this is a stand-up comedy routine. You can see people are all laughing by creating these emoji avatars. So the handshake gesture is a particularly thorny design problem. It came up among several of the interviewees as an area of complexity, since many of the social VR platforms use the handshake as a kind of double for a friending mechanism. So you shake someone's hand, and then, like you're seeing here, you see a kind of friend and added visualization. This can be a little problematic because there's a kind of assumption of, we have this gesture that we all know of shaking someone's hand, and you're expected to reciprocate, right? But when the gesture actually implies that you are now going to be their friend, there is a little bit more at stake when you actually do decide to shake someone's hand. Philip Lenson, the co-founder and developer of Anyland, kind of echoed this concern around sort of real-time expectations of friending reciprocity. He created a kind of way for people to avoid making this as a kind of binary decision. So you don't have to, he noted that you don't have to friend or unfriend people all the time as you go about your day, right? We're not having to constantly make those choices. Instead, when you go to a place, you are by degrees approaching social closeness to someone who is also at that place, right? So we have all these proxies for handling closeness in ways that are not binary. One of the interesting sort of things that emerged from our interview with a content developer for users of VR chat was the ways that new kinds of embodied communication rituals are kind of instigated by users. So if you're not going to use the handshake, and if you can't do a hug, for example, because you go through someone in social VR, users instead have innovated this in VR chat, have innovated this approach of kind of head patting as a kind of ritual of greeting. We also see this ritual of feeding as an important way of kind of communicating affection. Again, this was sort of framed as this is something useful to do because hugs are less satisfying. I've also seen VR chat users making out with one another, and one of the sort of satisfying things, and it's just a greeting, right? It's not like necessarily like, hey, let's have this extended sort of lascivious encounter. It's more like, okay, I'm gonna go now, let's make out. You'll see this, partly I think my hypothesis, and again, we haven't gotten to the user research portion of this study, but my sense is that part of this is that you hear the sound effects, right? So you have this really nice, you're feeling close with the person, but you also have this nice auditory feedback. So all of our interviewees describe the important role that aesthetics and architecture, or architectural features of place play in scaffolding social interaction. So this is another huge category. And indeed, places in social VR are often designed to leverage the social expectations of related environments from the physical world. I'll give you some examples. Rieke Jansen, the content creator for VR chat users, mentioned that She likes to leverage people's expectations about familiar places. You see there's a world that she designed that's sort of based on a beach, tropical island scenario. And she describes the sort of physiological impact of this placeness as a kind of shadow. She described it as, it's the shadow of a feeling that you get from your real experience with that place category, right? So in other words, a kind of slightly weak version of that feeling. And Corey Nolan, a programmer for Rec Room, noted that this echo or shadow of the real world also primes certain kinds of behavior, so much so that at Rec Room, they use this shorthand, rooms are behavior. Several designers also describe the importance of architectural features in the environment. So again, Jansen, who is a content creator for users of VRChat, mentioned that she likes to create these gathering spaces that have kind of like almost Stonehenge-like features, like the trees you see here, that are kind of permeable structures that you can approach from the outside and see what's going on inside, but nevertheless the folks inside feel secure. And Evan Sforza, the designer of Altspace VR, similarly noted a role that, or a similar role that cantilevered overhangs can play in kind of calming some deep part of our biology that fears threats from above. Architectural layout of space can also have a more sort of local effect on how people orient to one another. So for example, Facebook Spaces product designers, after some sort of series of iterations, they settled on a kind of circular table, and they also eliminated the teleport feature as a way to emphasize the shared eye lines and sort of shared attention necessary for a conversation. And Ishita Kapoor, again, the senior product manager at Altspace VR, noted that a similar social gathering role is played by the kind of campfire that I mentioned earlier in drawing people together around a shared spatial landmark. So Rec Room developers and community managers also stress the importance of architectural layout in an auditorium room that they had designed for a Q&A session. So I really like this example. They noted that they iterated several times on this space. At first, it didn't have any seating, like the couches you see. And it was kind of a madhouse because people would stand at the front. And as a result, they put in seating to make it feel more like a theater space, which encouraged users to sit down and be quiet. There's also this cat that you see in the top left. So this cat looks at whoever is holding the microphone at any given time. So it's an NPC, there's not a human avatar inside the cat. But it stares in the direction of whoever is wielding this microphone. And I think this is a particularly, it's a kind of bizarre example, but I think it's illustrative of the ways that you can start with familiar scaffolding. So we know what a Q&A is. But then there's this opportunity to kind of introduce new affordances of space that then the designers can very cleverly use to start augmenting and stretching our expectations of what's possible. So I wanted to talk about this. I'm sort of keeping this kind of sketchy because this is where this is my emergent thinking on this topic. But there's a kind of pattern that I'm seeing in many examples of social VR applications. And for lack of a better term, I'm calling this sort of pivot from the known to the unknown. So it goes like this. So first, designers embed known context cues in their VR environment. So like the architecture of a Q&A, for example. These context cues kind of leverage associations with familiar places that provide a kind of initial social scaffolding. And with this scaffolding in place, designers then rely on users' knowledge of social templates to kind of, from similar places they've been to suggest kind of norms and behavior. And then designers go a step further by shaping actions, calibrating spatial and embodied affordances. For example, you can't teleport onto the stage when you're in that Q&A environment, but you can teleport onto one of those couches if you're an audience member. And making these roles sort of meaningful. So for example, if you are invited onto the stage, then you can teleport onto the stage to participate as a speaker. With this scaffolding in place, they can then pivot by stretching social expectations in divergent ways, like I would argue the giant cat staring at whoever has the microphone is doing. And then these augmentations of the known world begin to bring out new categories of experience. So, for example, when life-size emojis are now emanating from your body, what does that do to the way you relate to others? How does it enable you to communicate with customers in real time? So each of these new categories of experience has the potential to define its own emergent set of norms and actions. And so this is the pivot I'm seeing again and again. You start with the familiar, you scaffold an initial social context, you use it to point to known behavioral templates, and then begin to stretch those expectations by augmenting them with novel affordances or remixing categories of experience. So I had some examples from the Museum of Other Realities. This is a museum environment that very quickly teleports you into these other landscapes that you can explore with others. And we're also seeing users do similar things with user-generated content. Anyland is sort of the perfect example of this because everything is user-generated content. But I think you can also look at the head padding example as a kind of user pivot in this way as well. And users can go beyond what designers are doing because they can kind of flip designers' expectations on their head. And if our recent history of social media offers any clues, these sorts of emergent rituals appear strange at first until we eventually start to recognize them as mundane parts of our everyday life. So I'm going to skip past onboarding and social buffering in the interest of time here, because I do want to talk about social VR with people you already know. So unlike open world environments like AltSpace VR, Anyland, VR Chat, FAO, and Rec Room, two of the applications we examined, Facebook Spaces and Mozilla Hubs, are both what you might call closed environments intended to be utilized by people who already know each other. And I think there's some specific things we can say about these mediums. So in particular, some of the interviewees from Mozilla Hubs pointed to the importance of what they call media porosity, insofar as kind of images and other 3D models from the web can easily be searched and brought into Hubs, so this idea of sort of webness, right? Both Facebook Spaces and Mozilla Hubs emphasize its importance of kind of bridging VR with the outside world. They're doing this in different ways, though. So for Mozilla Hubs, as I mentioned, kind of bringing in aspects of the web. For Facebook Spaces, it's about broadcasting live to your newsfeed or calling somebody on Facebook Messenger and bringing those outside faces into VR. They also talked a lot about the importance of device interoperability. And for Facebook Spaces, device interoperability also means asymmetric forms of participation. So you see in the left-hand corner there, you can actually type in comments if you are a audience member watching somebody perform in VR through your newsfeed. So high-level takeaways, we're pushing towards a kind of preliminary design framework. And we have this kind of elaborate, complex flowchart because the answer is, what are the right design choices? The answer is, it depends. So I'm seeing the time here, so I'm going to kind of quickly move through this just to get to the final points. So rather than have you dive into that flowchart, I just wanted to highlight two key forks. So whether your world is an open social VR experience or a closed world that you already know. And the second fork is whether you have heavy human moderation or minimal moderation. So we have the design considerations are different depending on where you fork in that process. But there's some general design considerations I think are worth mentioning. So leverage the known world to shape behavioral expectations and cue familiar social context through the aesthetics of place and architecture. Design places, activities, and social catalysts that encourage the kind of behavior you'd like to see. And take advantage of social contagion, for example, through incentive structures to sort of emphasize the kind of default expressive modalities and cultural seeding practices that otherwise would be associated with kind of community outreach. This can work in an environment, for example, that has heavy moderation as well as light moderation, closed world as well as open world, right? These are sort of general design considerations. And then I also have specific considerations for each of the, where you sort of lie in that fork. And I'd be happy to sort of unpack these a little bit more after the talk. Next steps, as I mentioned, we're diving into user research, and I'm going to thank the audience for being here. I think I have time for maybe one question.